I would like, if I may, to take you on a strange journey. It seemed a rather ordinary November night in 1973 when Brad Majors and his fiancée Janet Weiss left Denton to visit a Dr. Everett Scott, ex-tutor and now friend to both of them. It's true there were dark storm clouds, heavy, black and pendulous, towards which they were driving. It's true also that the spare tyre they were carrying was badly in need of some air. But they, being normal kids and on a night out, well, they weren't going to let a storm spoil the events of that evening. On a night out, it was a night out they were going to remember for a very long time. But now, in 2025, I need to tell you about something equally strange. A video game just appeared, on Steam, on the Nintendo eShop, the PlayStation Store, Xbox Store. No announcements, no marketing campaign, no influencers doing sponsored posts. It just manifested, as if it had been there all this time and nobody had noticed. Which is entirely possible because I once spent 15 minutes looking for my phone whilst using it as a torch. The Rocky Horror Show video game dropped on Halloween 2024. Made by Freak Zone Games, a name that sounds less like a developer and more like a nightclub that you'd find in a condemned building, it cost $9.99, which is cheaper than a ticket to one of those midnight screenings and significantly cheaper than the therapy that you're going to need afterwards. Now look, I bought this thing immediately because I am the exact sort of person that Freak Zone were hoping would stumble across this at 2 a.m. whilst browsing Steam. Rocky Horror and video games are a few of my favourite things, which does make it sound like I'm about to break out into a musical number about brown paper packages, but I promise I won't. I can't even say brown paper packages at this time of night. Combining these two things is either brilliant or a recipe for disappointment on a cosmic scale. This, incidentally, is the same purchasing instinct that got me a bread maker that's produced exactly 2 loaves of bread before being retired to live permanently on top of my kitchen cupboards. At least this only cost $10 and doesn't take up counter space. But here's the thing about licensed games. They are usually terrible. I mean, properly terrible. For every good one, there are 20 that belong in the Nevada desert next to those E.T. cartridges. And Rocky Horror seems particularly impossible to adapt. How do you turn Don't Dream It, Be It into jumping over spikes? How do you make a game about liberation when the main mechanic is avoid this thing over there or you die? And yet here we are, an actual Rocky Horror game. It's 192 megabytes, which is smaller than most PowerPoint presentations and about 1/8 the size of a modern game's day one patch. It promised chiptune versions of the songs, 8-bit graphics and infinite retries for those more accustomed to audience participation than D-pad coordination. So the question is, does this honour 50 years of Rocky Horror, or have I just spent $10 on something that belongs in the digital bargain bin? Let's take a walk in the rain, newspaper above our heads and controllers in our hands, and find out what awaits us in this interactive anniversary tribute. Will we find a light over at the Frankenstein place? Will we give ourselves over to absolute pleasure? Or will we find ourselves lost in time and lost in space and meaning? Let there be lips. So when the Rocky Horror Show video game came out, approximately 7 people noticed. There were no preview copies sent to IGN or Kotaku, no tweets building hype, no developer diaries. Freak Zone Games worked with Bitbot Media and Metal X Entertainment, company names that sound increasingly like they were generated by AI having a crisis. They just released it and hoped that Rocky Horror fans would stumble across it. Which they did eventually. Somebody posted about it on Reddit about November the 3rd with, "Wait, did anybody else know that this existed?" And that's how the word spread, organically, through confusion, if we're honest. This tells you everything about what this game is. It's not trying to be a game of the year. It's not competing with everything. It's a birthday card for Rocky Horror's 50th anniversary. And birthday cards don't need marketing campaigns. The timing worked, or at least kind of worked. Rocky Horror premiered as a stage show back in June 1973. The film came out in September 1975. So we were right in that golden anniversary window when it was released. Plus, it launched on Halloween, when Rocky Horror fans are at their peak enthusiasm, and wearing fishnets counts as formal wear. Of course, launching with zero marketing meant that the gaming press had no idea that it existed. As of writing this, there still isn't a Metacritic score because not enough reviewers have covered it. It exists in this weird space where Rocky Horror fans know about it and literally nobody else does. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The game starts properly. Not with a tutorial that treats you like you've never seen buttons before, but with narration, on-screen texts setting up Brad and Janet's journey. Those dark storm clouds, that broken down car. It's exactly what you want, a proper story setup before any jumping begins, whether it's to the left or to the right, nobody knows. And then when the platforming starts, it's good. It's really good. Actually, the movement is smooth, responsive. It feels exactly how 8-bit games should feel, but with that modern polish. You're not fighting controls. The jumping works. It's immediate, comfortable, which is great, except you die. Constantly. The whole game is designed to kill you. Spikes, enemies, pits, moving platforms that have clearly read your brain and know exactly when to move away. You'll die dozens of times per section, maybe hundreds if you're like me and have the reaction of a pensioner in treacle. But here's the clever bit. Infinite retries. No game overs, no limited lives, no punishment. You die, you respawn instantly, you try again. Which is perfect for Rocky Horror fans who maybe haven't touched a controller since the Super Nintendo and whose primary gaming experience is shouting slut at a cinema screen. So you play through Brad's section, dying repeatedly, but making progress, learning the patterns, and then you reach the end of that section and you switch to Janet. And what happens with Janet's levels is that they use the same corridors as Brad's, the same tiles, the same background art, the same basic layout, but the obstacles are different, recombined, remixed, rearranged. And then you play as Dr. Scott, and it happens all over again, the same hallways, new challenges. But if you're not familiar with how 8-bit games were made, this might sound like laziness, running out of budget. Someone at Freak Zone saying, "We've got 3 weeks left, just flip all the levels backwards and add some more spikes." But this is exactly how Nintendo Entertainment System games worked. When you're limited by cartridge memory, and we're talking severe limitations here, like every byte matter limitations. When you're like that, you reuse assets. You take the same tiles, the same sprites, and recombine them in new ways. Games I grew up with did this constantly. It wasn't corner cutting, it was a necessity, and it became part of what defined that era. Freak Zone hasn't just made a game that looks 8-bit, they've recreated the actual design constraints of 8-bit games. Asset reuse, level remixing, and making the most of limited resources. For anybody who grew up playing NES games, this feels instantly authentic. And here's the thing, it fits Rocky Horror perfectly. Rocky Horror thrives on repetitions. Fans watch the same film over and over again. They know every line, every song, every moment. The repetition is part of the ritual. So having a game that sends you through the same corridors multiple times, building on the theme each time, it works. It feels right. You'll hear the chiptune time warp approximately 4,000 times. By the end, it's either going to drive you insane or become weirdly comforting. I'm still not sure which ones happened to me. Possibly both. I may never recover. Now, let's talk about that 8-bit aesthetic, because it's not actually just a nostalgia thing. There was a Rocky Horror game in 1985 for the Commodore 64 and ZX Spectrum. By going back to that visual style 40 years later, Freak Zone has created really a sort of lovingly crafted temporal loop, a callback to a callback. The pixel art is clean, the character sprites are recognisable despite being about 12 pixels tall, and the mansion has that chunky charm that defined a generation of platformers. The chiptune music deserves special mention. I was in a Rocky Horror band in my youth. Yeah, we will discuss my questionable life choices at a later date. But I can hear how much work has gone into this arrangement because I know these songs right down to their component parts. Chiptune has this way of making everything sound either really brilliant or like a 2003 ringtone having a breakdown. There's no middle ground, but they have absolutely nailed it here. Sweet Transvestite in chiptune is unmistakably Sweet Transvestite, just squeezed through a sound from 1985. The composers preserved the melodies whilst embracing the limitations. Even the saxophone bits work, which should be impossible, but somehow isn't. Then we get to the boss battles. You fight Rocky, you fight Eddie, you fight Frank, and each fight shows the developers actually understood the source material. The Eddie fight, in particular, is quite clever. In the musical, Eddie doesn't survive his encounter with Frank. The game represents this. You weaken Eddie, but it's Frankenfurter who finishes him off. Not like that. This small detail, that's what shows that they're adapting a story, not just making a generic platformer with Rocky Horror branding. But that's also a problem for me as well. It feels weird fighting these characters. Rocky was never a threat. Neither was Eddie. They're victims. They're not villains. But this is what happens when you cram this story into a platformer. You need enemies. So characters become enemies, whether it makes narrative sense or not. The boss battles were my least favourite part about this. They're fine. They're functional. But they break the flow and they don't quite fit in with the story. There's also a clothing damage system, which sounds dodgy, but it's actually quite nice. It's a bit like a reference to Ghosts and Goblins. You take damage, you lose your clothes. In any other game, this would feel gratuitous, but in Rocky Horror, it's thematically perfect. The whole musical is about shredding inhibitions along with your clothes, and having Brad and Janet literally lose their outfits as they take damage is both a retro gaming reference and true to the source material. It made me smile anyway when I noticed it. That sort of attention to detail, I think, matters. The game takes 1 or 2 hours to complete depending on how often you die, which for me was constantly. I have the platforming skills of somebody who's learnt about a game by watching other people play it and assuming that I understand what was happening. I'm not bad at platformers, they're my favourite type of game actually, but I'm not a fan of those super precision ones, and there's elements of that super precision in this game here. But 1 or 2 hours seems perfect, actually. It's roughly how long the film takes to watch, and it's not asking for 40 hours of your life or demanding that you master complex systems. It's asking for one evening, one fun, silly evening where you jump around a pixelated mansion to a chiptune Rocky Horror soundtrack. For $9.99, that's reasonable. It's a Halloween novelty, something to enjoy, to finish, and maybe revisit next October when you're in the mood again. There are a few glitches, however. Objects phase through enemies, characters clip through platforms. There's nothing that's actually game-breaking about it because you've got the infinite retry system, which means that glitches can't actually stop you progressing. But they are noticeable. For a game that only lasts an hour, these rough edges stand out more than they would with something which was a little longer. They suggest the development was either rushed or the budget was tight. It's probably both, to be fair. These issues could have been caught with more testing time, but testing costs money, and Freak Zone were clearly working with limited resources. At $10, these problems are easier to forgive. They're there, they're annoying, but they don't really ruin everything. The critical reception has been all over the place with this. Impulse Gamer gave it 80 out of 100, calling it decent fun for fans. Way Too Many Games gave it 4.5 out of 10, saying that it will only appeal to die-hard Rocky Horror fans, and both the reviews are kind of right, I suppose. This game knows its audience and it serves that audience well, but it makes zero attempt to reach beyond that niche. Strip away the Rocky Horror branding and you've got a very basic 8-bit platformer that would struggle to stand up on its own. But you can't strip away the branding because the branding is kind of the entire point of the thing. This game doesn't exist to revolutionize platformers or to introduce innovative mechanics. It exists to give Rocky Horror fans a new way to engage with characters and music that they already love. It exists to mark 50 years with something interactive and playful. It exists because somebody at Freak Zone thought it would be fun to see Brad and Janet jumping over spikes to a chiptune soundtrack. And on those terms, it succeeds completely. The shadow-dropped release strategy is fascinating, at least to me. In an era where games are announced years in advance with massive marketing campaigns, Freak Zone just released it and hoped people wouldn't notice. Which is exactly how Rocky Horror became a phenomenon in the first place. Through word of mouth, through fans telling other fans, through organic discovery. The downside is limited coverage. By the time the gaming press noticed it existed, the initial buzz had passed. It lives in this strange space where Rocky Horror fans know about it, but the broader gaming world doesn't. And you know what? Maybe that's fine. Maybe not everything needs to be mainstream. Rocky Horror has survived 50 years by speaking to people who feel outside the mainstream. It's survived because it's weird and unconventional and gives people permission to be weird and unconventional too. Having a tiny 8-bit game that most people will never hear about feels entirely appropriate. This game was never going to win awards. It's not appearing on Game of the Year lists, but it doesn't need to. It needs to be fun, affordable, and an accessible way for Rocky Horror fans to celebrate 50 years. And it is. If you're a fan of the show, I would recommend this. Just go in with appropriate expectations and you'll get one more way to spend time in a world that's meant something to you. And if that sounds appealing, if that sounds worth an hour of your time and $10 of your money on a Halloween evening, then this game is absolutely for you. Sometimes a game doesn't need to change the world. Sometimes it can just exist to make a specific group of people smile. The Rocky Horror Show video game does just that. It's a small, strange, imperfect celebration of a small, strange, utterly perfect musical. And in a year marking 50 years of the Rocky Horror Picture Show, that feels entirely appropriate. But that's it from me. If you've enjoyed this, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the game, on Rocky Horror, on licensed games in general. And if you've played this one yourself, I'm particularly interested in your experience. Did it capture what you hoped it would? Did it disappoint? Did you also die consistently and question your gaming abilities? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks ever so much for watching. And just remember, this Halloween, don't dream it, game it. Happy Halloween, folks.